A warm welcome to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. I'm your moderator, Peter Lavelle. After being severely persecuted during the Soviet era, today Russia's Orthodox Church is experiencing a truly amazing renaissance. What accounts for the return to the faith in Russia? And do the church and state have more than a cozy relationship? To discuss this and more, I have two guests in London. Ksenia Denin, she is the chair of the Kestin Institute, and we have Peter Duncan. He's a senior lecturer in Russian politics and society at the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies, the University College London. Ksenia, if I can go to you first. In the last 20 years, the Orthodox Church has evolved immensely. Can you, in maybe a minute or so, tell me the difference between 1991 and 2013?
Can I just say first that this revival hasn't come out of nothing. A great deal was still going on quietly, in secret, even during the Stalin period, and certainly during the Khrushchev anti-religious campaign. So it hasn't come out of nothing.
But the public role of the church has changed immensely. I think you would agree with that.
Well, obviously, since the change in party policy of 1988, the religious freedom was introduced with the 1990 law, but alas, drastically curtailed by the law of 1997, which gives 4 traditional religions, and the only Christian religion listed is the Russian Orthodox Church. No mention of the Catholics, who've been in Russia since the 17th century, and no mention of the Protestants, of which there have been many, many different strands, certainly since the 18th century, many invited in by Catherine the Great. So, as you say, there's a great flourishing, but I think you should bear in mind there are restrictions as well. And there's certainly restrictions on any strand of Russian Orthodoxy which doesn't agree with the Moscow Patriarchate. There are other strands, admittedly very minor ones. And could I just add that I have a deep love of the Russian Orthodox Church, but I am also critical of some of the upper echelons. What I see in my travels, though, is grassroots. What I see is parish life, social work, wonderful educational work, extracurricular activities. To me, the great, important revival and genuine life of the church is at parish level.
That's very interesting. Peter, if I can go to you. What is the attraction here? Is it religiosity? Is it a sense of civil society? Because I think most would agree that we've been witnessing over the last 50 years, maybe 150 years, depending on how far you want to go back. We look at Europe, the secularization of the continent and the role of established religions like the Catholic Church in Protestant churches as well as certainly decreased. But then over the last 20 years, we see a revival, and I'm nodding my head to Ksenia in many different ways, the revival of Orthodoxy in Russia. Is it taking back what was taken away from you, or is there a deep need for religious life in this country? I mean, what accounts for it? Or is it just, going through the rituals?
I think it's several of those things. It's certainly a feeling after the decades of persecution of all forms of religion. There was the freedom that began under perestroika, under Gorbachev, that people could go to church without facing penalties. But the Russian Orthodox Church is very much linked up with Russian culture. Many people who go and say that they are believers, pravoslavny, or verushi. They say they're pravoslavny, they're Orthodox, but they're not believers, or they don't know very much about the religion. It's worth making the point from the start, I think, that the Orthodox Church was not well equipped to take advantage of the freedoms that it received. It was the other religions, from the West in particular, that showed the biggest growth. I mean, the Baptists and various sects, the Jehovah's Witnesses. In the late 80s, early 90s, there was quite a big move of, particularly for the United States, of fundamentalist groups into Russia.
Evangelical groups.
Evangelical groups, exactly, yes. You're absolutely right.
Because I can remember going on close to Red Square, and you would have someone translating these evangelicals from Kansas City. And they got a crowd. People went and listened, at least in the 1990s. I don't see that anymore today.
Well, the reason they don't see that anymore today is, as Zeni was saying earlier on, the law of 1997, the law on freedom of conscience, which reversed a lot of the changes that had been begun under Gorbachev in 1990, which gave this privileged position to Orthodoxy, Islam, Buddhism and Judaism at the expense of other Christian religions. And So now we have a situation where people from the United States, or even members of religious groups originating from the United States, have got a similar sort of status to what NGOs have as foreign agents. They're required to register. And so...
Well, if they're funded by foreign groups, there's probably nothing wrong with that. They have similar laws in the United States and many other Western countries.
No, they're very different in Russian. They're much tougher in Russian. They're directed against the propagation.
If you read the laws, as a matter of fact, they're even less stringent than some of the NGO laws in the United States. Ksenia, how much is this in your mind in looking at, because you know the Soviet period, perestroika, and then in the last 20 years, how much is it just a ethnicity issue? Is it affinity with Russian culture? It's just that extra layer.
I think that's true. There's a very close association with Russian national identity and the Russian Orthodox Church, and with some of the wonderful aspects of Russian culture. Obviously, we think of the icon, Andrei Rublev, some of the great works of visual art and of music. So there's a very close, connection between Russian culture. I would put down the need for religious faith in Russia to some of the aspects of Russian society, which is very, very tough, and life for a large part of the Russian population is extremely hard, and medical care isn't there. There are enormous social problems, and evidence obviously in drug addiction and alcohol addiction. So I think that
if I could stay, if I could stay with you, because you bring up a really good point here. I mean, how much, and you know far more about this than I do, and I live here, but how much is the church taking up the slack?
Right.
When it comes to dealing with drug addiction and with health care, because
Indeed.
I live in Moscow, and in living in Moscow is like living in London or New York. They're very specific to themselves and not to the rest of the country. And so outside of Russia, when I think of the Orthodox Church, I think of beautiful churches, but I don't see what they're doing. What are they doing?
Right. Every Russian Orthodox diocese today has a department for social work. To me, this is an aspect which shows the real future benefit to society. I've been to many, many dioceses. I think particularly at this moment of a most remarkable priest who founded a home for very disturbed boys outside the village of, not far from the village of Nericht, not far from Kostroma. I think of a school teacher up in Vologda who has founded masses of Orthodox clubs. The care of laity and clergy at grassroots level can be absolutely marvellous. In Astrakhan, for example, I met the head of the John the Baptist Monastery. Now, they're giving about 250 kids in this Sunday school, offering extracurricular activities, mostly arts, painting, music. There was a similar one I remember in outside, wait a minute, I've been to so many places, but it's this work at grassroots level, particularly the social work, which is very impressive, and I see the true Christian spirit being expressed. People who really have taken to heart the first two commandments, which is what the Christian religion is based on, love God and love your neighbour.
It's very interesting, Peter, to kind of continue on Ksenia's point. Before I went into radio and television, I was an investment banker, believe it or not. And what I found really interesting is that I used to rub shoulders with some extremely wealthy people in Russia, and there was almost a competition who could spend more money on restoring churches, not just in Moscow, but all the way out to Vladivostok. And it was almost, a competition who could do more. Well, I don't think it had anything to do with religiosity, but it was what you were, quote, supposed to do, because you made so much money in the 1990s. What are you giving back? This is an interesting phenomenon. It still goes back to the kind of your social standing and your ethnicity, because they were all Russians.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the classic example of this is the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, where the Pussy Riot event took place, because this was essentially built from donations that Mayor Yuri Lushkov persuaded the oligarchs and the big Russian industries to give money to.
I like how you used the word persuaded. Okay, I think we need to underline the word persuaded, because he had a lot of power to persuade people.
Yes, and businesses would not have been able to continue their work if they didn't contribute to Christ the Saviour.
You're listening to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. I'm your moderator, Peter Lavelle. Okay, Ksenia, let's go back to the ethnicity issue, which I think is interesting because, again, I'm living here in Moscow, and in the 15 years that I've lived here, particularly in the last 5 years, the immigration issue is really top of mind for just about the entire city because we've seen this huge influx of people from the Caucasus, and there's, I would say, kind of not white flight, but white people being spooked. And at the same time, I see this rise in religiosity and people going to the Orthodox Church. Do you see a connection there?
Just going back to this influx from the North Caucasus, it brings to mind the big potential problem of relations with Islam. Islam is not my field, but on the number front, the Muslims are getting pretty well on this, up to the level of the Orthodox. I don't know about escaping to the church because of the influx of immigrants. I absolutely agree with you that it's associated with your Russian national identity. But could I just also say there are a lot of people who take their Orthodoxy seriously and do study it. It may only be 10%, but I think we shouldn't sort of ignore that. It isn't purely an ethnic label. I don't honestly see that as the influx from the North Caucasus as being a cause for the increase in church-going. No.
Okay, Peter, I'm going to agree with Ksenia there. We shouldn't assume that everyone from the North Caucasus is some kind of fundamentalist when it comes to Islam. They certainly don't look that way when they're working in the streets.
No, you're absolutely right. Even so, one shouldn't exaggerate this extent to which people are going to church. So that you're right to focus on the fact that many churches have been built, but the surveys that are carried out by Russian sociologists show that it's still very much a minority exercise, regularly going to church. And in fact, it's quite a lot lower than in Western countries.
I know at Easter, according to the statistics for Moscow, for the Russian Orthodox attendance, I think it was only maximum 2%. And that is an educated, a large educated population. So it's quite surprising. I think overall, people put 10% for Orthodox, serious Orthodox.
Ksenia, it's very interesting. I mean, and I can just go from my own personal experience here because I'm not a scholar of the church or of any religion. But when Easter does come around or Russian Christmas comes around, I ask people what they're doing. And it's very ritual driven for the most part. When they're celebrating their fasting time, Easter, I don't know, maybe I'm being unfair here, but it's kind of like, again, showing some kind of social standing that you're observing the fast. But does it really mean something to your religious life? I don't see a very strong connection.
Well,
so
of course
ritual
there
still
is
playing a high
absolutely.
role.
I mean, there is this thing called obryada, which is just a ritualistic form of orthodoxy. Of course, there's a great deal of that. But orthodoxy, like Catholicism, like Anglicanism, is a sacramental form of Christianity. Therefore, these outward forms should have an inner spiritual meaning. And for many, they do. Therefore, going to church, being with other Christians, taking part in the liturgy is an actual experience of the presence of God. And of course, in the Orthodox, they have a great stress during the cherubic hymn of the presence of the saints, of those that have gone before us. So I don't think a ritual should be dismissed out of hand.
I agree.
It can contain enormous, great meaning.
Okay, Peter, I want to go back to a topic that both of you have brought up in the program, and that is the relationship between the state and the church. And from what you've both said so far, it seems like you both think that's a little too cozy. Peter?
Well, I would put it this way, that the church and the state are independent of each other. It's important to make that point, and they both have their own interests. When I say the church, I'm really talking now about the Moscow Patriarchate as an institution, rather than the whole body of believers in the traditional sense of the church. And the church looks to the state for support against other religions, and the state and the Putin regime in particular, looks for support from the church against other political forces. And we've seen that.
Agreed, but going back to what Ksenia said earlier, when the communist regime came to an end, the Orthodox Church found itself kind of flat-footed because we had a lot of other groups coming in, and so the church is saying, give us a discount, give us a premium, so we can get our act together. Ksenia, what's wrong with that?
I don't disagree with that, but I think one should give equal rights to other Christian denominations as well as to Judaism, Buddhism and Islam. I see great things being done by Catholics and Protestants. I've met in Kamchatka, for example, a wonderful group of fairly mild charismatics, but caring, doing fantastic missionary work. So
Are they persecuted?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I don't use the word really persecution. There's discrimination against, in many areas, against the non-Orthodox. The cosy relationship. It's interesting that during the demos in autumn 2011 and before the presidential election, at first, just before, I think about Christmas time, Patriarch Kirill was saying the government really should listen to society. But by the 8th of February, when a meeting was called in the Danilov monastery, he was saying quite the opposite. I understand the fear of immense social destabilization, but it was taking an extreme view, saying that, these are dangerous people, they're going to promote chaos. I think also it's a very interesting point. One should bear in mind that Patriarch Kirill's ideal society is not a democratic one, is not one where there are parties or free elections. His ideal state is the symphonia between church and state demonstrated in medieval Russia. He looks to Byzantium and then says, but Russia did it even better. The relationship between church and state was perfect. And he's even praised the period of Ivan the Terrible. So there is a different political ideal, a very romantic one, I would say, which doesn't fit in, I would think, with Putin's aims.
Well, I don't see, why would we assume that the Orthodox Church should be talking about democracy in political parties? Why should they?
Well, because most Christian churches are concerned with human beings and with fairness within society, want people to be represented politically. Every Christian church, even in autocratic polities, support human rights and democracy, I think, as a general rule. So the Russian Orthodox Church is an exception.
Well, I think the Russian Orthodox Church is an exception in many ways, considering what happened to it during the Soviet period. Peter, let's continue this relationship between church and state here, because if I can turn it around upside down, the political aspect of it, of course, the ruling political elite here sees their political ideology as more and more seen as being conservative, and of course the church is a natural ally.
Yes, they want the church to be conservative.
Well, do you think they have to tell the church to be conservative?
Well, if we remember, there were more liberal strains in the Orthodox Church in the 1980s and 1990s. And it's significant, I think, that, for example, Father Gleb Yakunin, who was one of the main principal fighters for religious rights in the Brezhnev era, he was never defrocked by the church until after the collapse of communism. It was only after the church had got greater freedom from the state and that it moved against Yakunin. And then one thinks about Father Alexander Mien, who was murdered. We still don't know exactly who was behind this. There are suspicions that more conservative forces within the church didn't like his successes and his liberal sort of thinking. So there are different trends. There are also trends in the church, in the Russian Orthodox Church, that are much more nationalistic than Patriarch Kirill.
You're listening to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. I'm your moderator, Peter Lavelle. Peter, if I can go back to you, this is something that is very interesting to me, and I think, Ksenia, you've already alluded to it. Again, my observation is that there is the laity and people doing good work and people that are true believers. But then there's the wealth of the hierarchy, which is stunning sometimes in Moscow. What is the relationship there? I mean, is the hierarchy listening to the laity? Is the laity just going on its own ways, the way it sees itself, its own community? I mean, how much of a strong connection is there between the two?
Well, I don't think you can talk in abstract terms about the laity, really. These are human beings with lots of different ideas, and these different ideas are reflected in the hierarchy as well as among the laity. I was trying to say that over the last couple of decades, the more conservative parts, the parts that are closer to power, have come to the fore in the Moscow Patriarchate. But I wouldn't want to go further than that.
I think also that Patriarch Kirill is trying to create a bureaucratically efficient church. He wants to control all his bishops, which is jolly difficult. I think particularly of the Diocese of Pskov, where Bishop Yevsevy was in charge. This was where Father Pavel Eidelheim was a priest. He had a dreadful time under that bishop, but there was no way that the centre could actually control or stop him. At least I don't see any institutional way in which he could have been stopped in what he was doing.
Well, what accounts for this drive for centralization of power? Because there's other competing faiths, or because the middle ranks have different, maybe they're more politicized, more liberal. I'm trying to put my mindset as how the Pope tries to control all the cardinals and the bishops. I mean, is this something similar being played out in Russia? I'm not asking you to be an expert in the Catholic Church too. Sorry. No, but what accounts for the centralization, and why to bureaucratize
Well,
it?
I think it's Patriarch Kirill's his nature. He ran his own diocese of Smolensk extremely efficiently, and a lot of interesting things were going on there. He had a theological, I think, a seminary, which was quite a pool of freedom. A lot of good things were going on there, but it was controlled from the centre. He had absolute say in what was going on. I think he sees that he would like the church to be run along those same efficient lines, but it's quite a difficult job. I'm not quite au fait with some of his recent appointments, but I believe I was in Archangel a few years ago, and the bishop there is a much more conservative one. So I think there may be attempts to move the chessboard and get people in place who will toe his line.
Peter, you mentioned something earlier in the program, which I think is interesting, and the relationship between Russian nationalists, and I use the word nationalists in this case in a slightly negative way because of intolerance, and its connection to the Orthodox Church. Because during the demonstrations, which are widely exaggerated at times in Western media, you do have members of the clergy. I don't know how high up they are, but they are obviously members of the clergy, and with what people would obviously connect with a Russian nationalist. I mean, how uncomfortable do you feel about that?
Well, I think it is the case that within the church there are people who just feel that Russians are the best people. I mean, we don't have the Russian messianism. The concept of the Russian people being the chosen people is an idea that goes back hundreds of years.
Well, do you think that's what it is, or is it it's against some what's perceived as the globalization of Western liberal values coming to Russia? We've mentioned also earlier in the program different religious groups. There are elements of Islamophobia, but it's not as profound as I think a lot of people might think, considering the extent of the Islamic community in Russia. I mean, there's different angles to this.
Yes, I mean, that's both anti-Islamic, anti the Chechens. I mean, it's significant how the Moscow Patriarchate didn't speak out against the repressive activities by first Yeltsin and then Putin in Chechnya and in the North Caucasus generally. But on the other hand, in relation to the West, the fear of liberal ideas, democratic ideas on the one hand, the fear of
I mean, let me give you, let's give a concrete example. I mean, I wanted to bring it up to show that I like to talk about these things. There's a whole anti-gay law, quote unquote, which is not a law, it's an amendment to another law about gay propaganda protecting minors. And again, I talk to believers and they just say to me, I can't believe you glorify in the West these type of values, because they're not my values. Why should you tell us to be tolerant of something that we abhor? Now, I'm saying these are not my opinions. I'm telling you opinions that I hear on a very regular basis.
Well, in the West, we think of these things that on the whole they should be kept private. People shouldn't be discriminated against because of their particular orientation. I certainly wouldn't use the word glorification of any one.
Well,
Hollywood
films. We could look at the number of films that do glorify it. Okay, and that's it. And this is what people watch them and say, well, why do you think that's such a great idea? Why don't they keep it to themselves? I'm again repeating things I hear.
Well, one shouldn't assume that Western culture can be reduced to one or two Hollywood films, I would say. But
okay, fair enough.
But The difficulty is that the Russian society is somewhere like where we were in Britain, for example, in the 1960s. When I was a boy, all homosexual activity was illegal. It wasn't made legal until the Sexual Offences Act of 1967. That's less than 50 years ago. Up until then, homosexuality performing homosexual acts was a criminal offence.
And we have to point out during the same time in the Soviet Union, it was illegal.
Exactly. It continued to be illegal.
Be
Britain, yes, exactly. Britain changed in 1967. I'm not sure when the United States changed. The Russian Federation changed only in 1993. So it's taken decades and decades in Britain for prejudice to work its way out. It's only in the last year or so that.
But that's the contradiction, Ksenia, isn't it? I mean, now we have a revival. In this program, we've talked about what that term revival means, and it means many different things. Revival of the church, the revival of religious ideas, including orthodoxy, and then you have this competing discourse coming from the West, this what I call the globalization of Western values, and they're coming on head on. It's a collision.
I suppose I'm a great supporter of the westernizers from the 19th century who, the educated classes of Russian society were open to Western literature. I still see that as true amongst the educated within Russia today. There isn't this extraordinary fear of Western values. I agree it is in some areas of the Russian Orthodox Church, and I am very obviously critical of any form of homophobia, which I see absolutely in all parts of Russian society, and we're not all parts of the Russian Orthodox Church. I know many members of the Church who are very kind and understanding and not condemning of people because of their sexual orientation.
Peter, I'm going to give you the last word on the program. Collision between Western values and the resurgence of everything that we have talked about on this program, Russian identity, Russian religiosity, the church.
Well, the church does try to sees itself as representing these traditional Russian values, and the regime, the Putin administration, over the last year and a half, with the big wave of political protests, with these demands for democracy that come from within Russia itself, come from within Russian society. The regime likes to blame the West for it, as if the protesters were being paid for by the American embassy and the church.
For it. There are foreign agents here under Russian law that get money from the West. There's good reason to be skeptical of spending Western money in Russia for political aims that don't originate here.
Peter, there's every reason to be skeptical of the view that the people who are demonstrating in Bolotnaya were all paid for by the American
you're
embassy.
Absolutely right, because I've been to every single demonstration there. I have been there too, just to make a point, to take pictures, to put on Facebook, to show who's there. And unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you very much, Ksenia and Peter, for a fascinating discussion on Russian religion and the church and state in Russia. Stay with VOR.